everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Lord of the Rings AMA podcast. My name is Matthias Austin, and on this podcast, I invite you to ask me anything about Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or anything related to the greater legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I will do my best to give you as in-depth an answer as I can. If you'll allow me, I'd like to start a bit differently today. This last week, my brother and his family had to say goodbye to their dog Scout, and I would like to say a few words. If Scout were a character in Lord of the Rings, I think she would be Bilbo. You see, Scout must have had the Ring of Power because she lived to a very old age, nearly 17 years old. She helped raise my nieces, all three of them being younger than her, just as Bilbo took in Frodo. She was adventurous when she needed to be, full of a manic energy, but was equally content to spend her time enjoying the pleasant comforts of a couch. And in a very Hobbit fashion, she always enjoyed a nice grilled chicken, often prepared by my mother when they would dog-sit her. Now, just as Bilbo wore thin and sailed away into the west, so too did the years weigh heavily on her, and rest and healing could no longer be found here in Middle-earth. Namarie, Scout. May you find the straight road to Valinor, where you can run with the hounds of Orome and rest in the gardens of Lorien. Nick, Rachel, Sophia, Avery, and Haley know that Scout was loved during her time on this earth, and though it does little to ease the pain, your loss is shared by all who knew her. Well, thank you for indulging me. A love of the natural world is a common theme throughout Tolkien's works, and the fellowship between humans and pets can be as strong as that of the Fellowship of the Ring. And now we'll go back to our normal routine here, and we're going to turn to today's question, which was submitted, like all of our questions are, by emailing lotramapod@gmail.com, just like this week's question asker, Julia from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Julia asks, what gives with the disparity in the weapons? The men, elves, and dwarves have horses, swords, knives, bows, and arrows, and archers, while Sauron's folks have elephants, big dogs, trolls, flaming catapults, and all manner of weapons of mass destruction. Why can't the first party get some better armaments? Well, thank you, Julia, for that question. You know, I'll be honest, this is the sort of question I never would have thought about doing before this show, and the research I did took me to all over the place. And actually, it's not quite true that I wouldn't have given this topic much thought, because I very distinctly remember seeing The Fellowship of the Ring in the theater when I was in 8th grade with my good friend Andrew. Now, apart from being completely enamored with the movie, we also spent a good deal of time afterwards making jokes about how much easier it would have been if Frodo just had an Uzi. And I think I've come across a meme before showing like the 1,100-plus page Lord of the Rings labeled The Lord of the Rings, and a much smaller book next to it labeled The Lord of the Rings If Pippin Had a Gun. So maybe this is a more common idea than I originally thought. But in all seriousness, I do think that there are 3 primary ways to answer your question. And I'll go through each of them, but here's a brief preview to my answer. First, I think that despite the seeming disparity, the weapons of the good guys are more than a match for the forces of evil. Secondly, the good guys and bad guys are fighting different wars with different goals, which require different weapons. And finally, I think that Tolkien's personal worldview, as shown through the many, many letters he wrote, was that the desire for bigger and better weapons actually makes you a bad guy. We'll see if you agree. Let's get into it. So to start, I do think that the weapons of the good guys are more than up to the challenge, as evidenced by the fact that, the good guys won. But, beyond that, we are given numerous examples in the books about how good the weapons are. Let's start with a few of the big-ticket items here, the weapons that received names and backstories. So first up is the most famous sword in the series, Anduril, Flame of the West, Aragorn's sword. Now here's how it's described in The Fellowship of the Ring. The sword of Elendil was forged anew by elvish smiths, and on its blade was traced a device of 7 stars set between the crescent moon and the rayed sun, and about them were written many runes, for Aragorn son of Arathorn was going to war upon the marches of Mordor. Very bright was that sword when it was made whole again. The light of the sun shone redly in it, and the light of the moon shone cold, and its edge was hard and keen. And we see the effect of that sword, Anduril, in action in the Two Towers during the Battle of Helm's Deep, where Tolkien writes, "A broad stairway climbed from the deep up to the rock, and the rear gate of the Hornburg. Near the bottom stood Aragorn. In his hand still Anduril gleamed, and the terror of the sword for a while held back the enemy, as one by one all who could gain the stair passed up towards the gate." And you'll note here, it's not the terror of Aragorn or his prowess as a fighter. It's a fear of the sword. And this isn't the only time we see the forces of evil, cowed by a special weapon. The same thing happens in The Hobbit. After Gandalf outsmarts the trolls, Bilbo and the dwarves, they find in the troll horde 2 swords, one of which Gandalf takes, the other Thorin claims. And when they show them to Elrond in Rivendell, he examines them. This is what the book says. "That day he looked at the swords they had brought from the troll's lair, and he said, 'These are not troll make. They are old swords, very old swords of the high elves of the west, my kin. They were made in Gondolin for the goblin wars. They must have come from a dragon's hoard or goblin plunder, for dragons and goblins destroyed that city many ages ago. This Thorin, the runes named Orcrist, the goblin cleaver in the ancient tongue of Gondolin. It was a famous blade. This Gandalf was Glamdring, foe hammer, that the king of Gondolin once wore. Keep them well.' And later we see those swords in action in the fight against the goblins of the Misty Mountains. Then Gandalf lit up his wand. Of course it was Gandalf, but just then they were too busy to ask how he got there. He took out his sword, and again it flashed in the dark by itself. It burned with a rage that made it gleam if goblins were about. Now it was as bright as blue flame for delight in the killing of the great lord of the cave. It made no trouble whatever of cutting through the goblin chains and setting all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. The sword's name was Glamdring the Foehammer, if you remember. Now bear in mind, these swords, they're a minimum of 6,500 years old, because we know they came from Gondolin in the First Age, and they'd spent much of their history bouncing around from plunderer to plunderer, but there's an almost genetic memory amongst the goblins about these swords. Now, Sting is another example. It was found in the same troll horde. It also came from Gondolin, and it was able to pierce the skin of a cave troll, cut the webs of Shelob, and puncture through Shelob herself. Now, I can hear the argument, okay, but those are special magic elvish-made swords. Regular people didn't have that. Which is true. But the good guys did have a lot going for them, even without named blades of destiny. We learn that the elves of Lothlorien used longbows. Now, Tolkien, he was a medievalist. He loved the Middle Ages. And much of his academic study was done on the subject of the early Middle Ages. In fact, one of the first big publications he had was a modern translation of Beowulf, which was originally written sometime between 700 and 1000. And so for much of that time in the early Middle Ages, the image of, knights in suits of armor, it wasn't a thing. They didn't show up until the late Middle Ages. And Tolkien almost exclusively talks about the armor worn in Lord of the Rings, whether Orcish or Mannish or Elvish, as being male armor, those shirts of interlocking rings. Which is, that's very different from the movies, which show the Knights of Gondor in plate armor. But going back to the longbow, modern tests of the Old English longbow, likely what the bows of the Galadrim, which are the elves of Lothlorien, those bows were probably modeled on the English longbow. And the modern tests of those bows show that arrows fired from these bows could fully puncture chainmail. So right there, the elves have this technological advantage because nobody else has the longbows like the elves. So okay, that's the elves accounted for. How about dwarves? Well, we're told in the Silmarillion about the dwarves' ability in crafting armor. In the tempering of steel alone of all the crafts, the dwarves were never outmatched, even by the Noldor, and in the making of mail of linked rings, which was first contrived by the smiths of Belagost, their work had no rival. The hauberks, which are like the mail shirts, they're called hauberks, the hauberks of the dwarves were so fashioned that they rusted not, but shone ever as if they were newly burnished. And we also know from the Silmarillion that dwarves, they're very slow to change, and they have extensive memories of their history. So likely this craft hadn't faded in the Third Age of Middle-earth. So the dwarves, they are sitting on the best defensive military equipment that goes along with their axes and warhammers. Now, as for men in Middle-earth, the cavalry of the Rohirrim probably would have been the most powerful fighting force in Middle-earth. You see, for much of the Middle Ages, mounted troops were the main difference between victory and defeat. They'd be used as like shock troops. They'd charge in and scatter the enemy infantry, which is something that we see happen in Lord of the Rings, both at the Battle of Helm's Deep and the Battle of Pelennor Fields. In a letter to Rona Bear in 1958, Tolkien described the Rohirrim as being modeled on the Normans, as depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry. That the Normans, they were the force that invaded England and defeated the Saxons in 1066. And while the forces of Sauron had, some warg riders, the guys who rode on those big wolves, the numbers we see in the books of warg riders are rarely more than just small scouting parties. Now, the men of the south, the Haradrim, they were said to have cavalry at Pelennor Fields, but their cavalry was defeated by the Rohirrim. Now, the men of Harad did have olifants, which, it's hard to not to imagine that they were modeled after the Carthaginian general Hannibal, who famously used war elephants in the Second Punic War against Rome. And they could be fearsome, certainly, but again, the Haradrim, they did lose the fight, and in fact, this superior weapon of the war elephants could sometimes be a liability. In the Two Towers, Sam witnesses one going wild after being struck by many, many arrows. This is what it says. On the great beast thundered, blundering in blind wrath through pool and thicket. Arrows skipped and snapped harmlessly about the triple height of his flanks. Men of both sides fled before him, but many he overtook and crushed to the ground. So a rampaging war elephant is just as dangerous for the side that you're fighting against as it is for your own side. And Gondor, let's talk about the people of Gondor. Now, they were the most, quote-unquote, advanced human civilization in Lord of the Rings. And they were known for their weaponry. They were descendants of the Númenóreans. And in the Unfinished Tales, Tolkien writes this about, Númenórean culture. Among the rights of the Edain were weaponsmiths, and they had, with the teaching of the Noldor, acquired great skill in the forging of swords, of axe blades, and of spearheads and knives. Swords the Guild of Weaponsmiths still made for the preservation of the craft. And so while Gondor, yes, they were less powerful than Númenor, but much of that knowledge of crafting would have filtered down. I think if numbers were equal in the fight against Sauron, the good guys, they would have won in like an instant. You see, the real superior weaponry that Sauron had was numbers. Take the Battle of Helm's Deep, for instance. In the books, not in the movies, because the elves don't show up in the books, but in that battle in the books, 300 Rohirrim, mostly those that were too old or too young to be actual soldiers, defended the Helm's Deep against roughly 10,000 Uruk-hai, before they were eventually saved by the arrival of Gandalf, Lord Erkenbrand, and roughly 3,000 cavalry. But there was still like more than a 3-to-1 advantage for Sauron, and he lost. At the Pelennor Fields, we're also told that there were about 3,000 defenders within the walls of Minas Tirith, and about 6,000 Rohirrim arrived, and an unknown amount of soldiers came with Aragorn in the army he brought up from the south. Meanwhile, we know that just the Haradrim had about 18,000, and there was a much larger, unknown total number of Easterlings and Orcs that, when that army left Minas Morgul in the Two Towers, it's described like this. Sam and Frodo and Gollum, they see this army leaving Minas Morgul, and it's described, "So great an army had never issued from that vale since the days of Isildur's might. No host so fell and strong in arms had yet assailed the fords of Anduin. And yet it was but one, and not the greatest, of the hosts that Mordor now sent forth." Yeah, the army at the Pelennor, outside of Minas Tirith, was Sauron's small army. At the battle of before the Black Gate, the one that served as like a distraction so Sauron didn't notice Frodo going to Mount Doom, we're told that there were 10 times and more than 10 times the troops of the good guys. And the good guys, the armies of the West, had less than 6,000 troops. So 10 times and more than 10 times of less than 6,000, we're looking at least 60,000, a 10-to-1 advantage. And none of this is to mention the armies that Sauron had attacking the Lonely Mountain and Lothlorien in the north. And see, this also leads me to my second point, that Sauron had these big attacking armies. And it's that the disparity in weaponry can also be explained by, the type of war being fought. With the exception of the Battle of the Black Gate, which, the good guys, they would have lost had the ring not been destroyed. The good guys were always fighting a defensive war, while Sauron was fighting a war of conquest. Helm's Deep, Minas Tirith, Erebor, and Lothlorien in the north. The good guys were holed up. They were trying to withstand the attack. And when you're fighting in that position, you don't need things that can tear down walls and breach gates. Having battering rams at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields and Minas Tirith for the good guys would have been largely pointless. And on that battle, they did have defensive catapults because, in Return of the King, we're told that they couldn't reach the siege engines of Mordor until they were close to the wall, but that once the siege towers were close, many of them were destroyed, so they did have defensive weaponry to combat these big siege towers. And the good guys, they didn't take these siege weapons to the Black Gate because they never had any intention to break it down and to get into Mordor. The whole thing was very much for lack of a better term, it was a suicide mission in the hopes that it would buy Frodo time, and luckily for our heroes, it worked. In fact, there is only one instance in all of the books of the good guys going on the offensive against an entrenched enemy, and that was the Ents in the Battle of Isengard. And this is actually a very interesting point because Julia mentioned trolls in her question. But you see, just as orcs were made in mockery of elves and men, and dragons were made to combat the eagles, trolls were first created by Morgoth to mimic Ents. When the Ents, they decide to attack Isengard, which, it happens much earlier in the books than it does in the movies, there's a conversation between Treebeard and Merry and Pippin. "Will you really break the doors of Isengard?" asked Merry. "Oh, well, we could, You do not know, perhaps, how strong we are. Maybe you have heard of trolls. They are mighty strong, but trolls are only counterfeits made by the enemy in the great darkness in mockery of Ents, as orcs were of elves. We are stronger than trolls. We are made of the bones of the earth. We can split stone like the roots of trees, only quicker, far quicker, if our minds are roused. If we are not hewn down or destroyed by fire or blast of sorcery, we could split Isengard into splinters and crack its walls into rubble." And this is actually what we see happen. Merry, he describes to Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas what happened during that assault on Orthanc. This is what Merry says. "An angry Ent is terrifying. Their fingers and their toes just freeze onto rock, and they tear it up like bread crust. It was like watching the work of great tree roots in 100 years, all packed into a few moments. They pushed, pulled, tore, shook, and hammered, and clang, bang, crash, crack. In 5 minutes, they had these huge gates just lying in ruin. And some were already beginning to eat into the walls like rabbits in a sandpit. I don't know what Saruman thought was happening, but anyway, he did not know how to deal with it." See, that's the sort of power that Sauron and the forces of evil wish they had at their disposal. Even trolls, they have to use, clubs as weapons. And see, this is maybe another way we see the good guys, they do have better resources. And the native strength, the strength inherent to the forces of good, is greater than that to the forces of evil. And this is why Sauron, he still loses these battles despite having a 3 or 5 or 10 times advantage. The good in Tolkien's world has an inherent advantage over evil. But the thing that balances it is that there's just a lot more evil than good. And this leads me to the last part of Julia's question. What about all sorts of weapons of mass destruction? Can't the good guys get some better armaments? And this, I must concede, is true. The technological innovation in warfare definitely is more in favor of the forces of evil. And from the very outset in The Hobbit, Tolkien makes it clear that these inventions are bad. He wrote, "Now goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once, for wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them, and also not working with their own hands more than they could help. But in those days and those wild parts they had not advanced, as it is called, so far." And in The Lord of the Rings, we see Saruman use what is essentially, gunpowder to blow a hole in Helm's Deep. And Return of the King, there's these descriptions of orcs filling trenches. Let me read it to you. "Busy as ants, hurrying orcs were digging lines of deep trenches in a huge ring, just out of bowshot from the walls. And as the trenches were made, each was filled with fire, though how it was kindled or fed, by art or devilry, none could see." So you got explosives, unseen methods of producing flame. This is Sauron bringing warfare in Middle-earth to the modern age. And I think Tolkien would say that the desire for that, the desire for better armaments, and certainly things that could, counter weapons of mass destruction, the desire for that is a trait that makes you a bad guy. And to set the tone for this line of argument, I want to start with one of, in my opinion, the best quotes in all of Lord of the Rings. It comes from Faramir in The Two Towers. "War must be while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend." Now, Tolkien, he hated allegory. And he was definitely opposed to the idea of, a self-insert character, a character that represented him as the author. But he did share many similarities with Faramir. He gave Faramir the same recurring dream that Tolkien himself had, for one thing. And for the other, Faramir was, at his heart, a scholar rather than a soldier. At the outset of World War I, Tolkien actually deferred his service until he completed his studies, at a time when most young men were dropping out of school to join the war. He wrote about this experience in a letter to his son Michael in 1941, who was serving in the British military. Tolkien wrote, "War broke out while I still had a year to go at college. In those days, chaps joined up or were scorned publicly. It was a nasty cleft to be in, especially for a young man with too much imagination and little physical courage." Now, he would eventually go on to fight in the war, and the experiences left him forever changed, as it did to all of those soldiers who returned. It's hard not to see similarities when describing, the trenches outside of Minas Tirith, or the bodies of the slain lying in the dead marshes, or the blasted and ruined description of the land of Mordor. And this is likely what shaped that line from Faramir, that war for war's sake is not a good thing. Tolkien wrote in another letter to Michael, "One war is enough for any man. I hope you will be spared a second. Either the bitterness of youth or that of old age is enough for a lifetime. Both is too much. I suffered once what you are going through." And in a letter to his son Christopher, who served in the Royal Air Force, Tolkien wrote, "It was always against your choice of service, on the ground it seems a war behind, but at least it should not rather land you often into the animal horror of the life of active service on the earth, such as trench life as I knew it." And in another letter, Tolkien wrote again to Christopher, "I cannot tell you how much I miss you, dear man. I would not mind it if you were happier or more usefully employed. How stupid everything is, and war multiplies the stupidity by 3 and its power by itself. So one's precious days are ruled by 3x squared, where x equals normal human crassitude, and that's bad enough." And maybe one of the most blunt things he wrote on the subject of war was in yet another letter to his son Christopher. "The utter stupid waste of war, not only material but moral and spiritual, is so staggering to those who have to endure it, and always was, despite the poets, and always will be, despite the propagandists. Not, of course, that it has not been necessary and will not be necessary to face it in an evil world. But so short is human memory and so evanescent are its generations that In only about 30 years, there will be few or no people with that direct experience which alone goes really to the heart. The burnt hand often teaches most about fire. I sometimes feel appalled at the thought of the sum total of human misery all over the world at the present moment. The millions parted, fretting, wasting in unprofitable days. Quite apart from the torture, pain, death, bereavement, injustice. If anguish were visible, almost the whole of this benighted planet would be enveloped in a dense dark vapor, shrouded from the amazed vision of the heavens. And the products of it will all be mainly evil, historically considered. And those were his thoughts about a war he thought was justified. Clearly, Tolkien was not a man who thought of war as a glorious thing. At best, it was a thing in his mind that was a necessary evil, and at worst, it was just plain evil. And some of what made it so evil was the development of more efficient weapons of war. This is what Tolkien wrote to Christopher. Again, they wrote so many letters to each other about Christopher's service in the RAF. I fear an air force is a fundamentally irrational thing, per se. I could wish dearly that you had nothing to do with anything so monstrous. It is, in fact, a sore trial to me that any son of mine should serve this modern Moloch. But such wishes are vain, and it is, I clearly understand, your duty to do as well in such service as you have the strength and aptitude to do. In any case, it is only a kind of squeamishness, perhaps, like a man who enjoys steak and kidney, or did, but would not be connected with the butchery business. As long as war is fought with such weapons, and one accepts any profits that may accrue, such as preservation of one's skin and even victory, it is merely shirking the issue to hold war aircraft in special horror. I do so all the same. In a later letter, he wrote, "It would be at least some comfort to me if you escaped from the RAF, and I hope, if the transfer goes through, it will mean a real transfer and a recommission. It would not be easy for me to express to you the measure of my loathing for the Third Service, which can be, nonetheless, and is for me, combined with admiration, gratitude, and above all, pity for the young men caught in it. But it is the aeroplanes of war that are the real villain, and nothing can really amend my grief that you, my best beloved, have any connection with it. My sentiments are more or less those that Frodo would have had if he discovered some hobbits learning to ride Nazgul birds for the liberation of the Shire." And liberation of the Shire was in quotes there. He made his opinions on the subject of the mechanization of war even more clear in a letter from 1945. While the First War of the Machines seems to be drawing to its final inconclusive chapter, leaving, alas, everyone the poorer, many bereaved or maimed, and millions dead, and only one thing triumphant, the machines. As the servants of the machines are becoming a privileged class, the machines are going to be enormously more powerful. What's their next move? And on the subject of weapons of mass destruction, the forces of good in Lord of the Rings, they did have one. The ring. The ring could have been used to end the war, were it given to Gandalf or Galadriel, possibly even Aragorn. That's why the ring is so tempting. The forces of good, they were vastly outnumbered, evil was on the rise, and the world was getting darker. Why not just use the ring to vanquish Sauron, overcome his control over the orcs, tear down the Tower of Barad-dûr, rebuild the world into a better place? Because anyone who used such a thing, who sought to gain the technological superiority in the fight, would be overcome by it, and become just as bad, if not worse, than Sauron. Gandalf says in the Fellowship of the Ring to Frodo, "Do not tempt me, for I do not wish to become like the Dark Lord himself. Yet the way of the ring to my heart is by pity, pity for weakness and the desire of strength to do good. Do not tempt me. I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe, unused. The wish to wield it would be too great for my strength. I shall have such need of it. Great perils lie before me." Tolkien, in a draft of a letter, I don't have it in front of me who it was to, he drafted this letter in 1963. He wrote, "If Gandalf proved the victor, the result would have been for Sauron the same as the destruction of the ring. For him it would have been destroyed, taken from him forever. But the ring and all its works would have endured. It would have been the master in the end. Gandalf as Ring Lord would have been far worse than Sauron. He would have remained righteous, but self-righteous. He would have continued to rule and order things for good, in quotes, and the benefit of his subjects according to his wisdom, which was and would have remained great. In the draft, it ends there, but in the margin, Tolkien wrote, "Thus, while Sauron multiplied evil, he left good clearly distinguishable from it. Gandalf would have made good detestable and seem evil." And see, this is why the plan was never to rely on the weapons of war for victory. The only victory would come by refusing to play the game of the enemy, and instead seek to destroy the ultimate weapon in Middle-earth. Or as Gandalf says after the Battle of the Pelennor, "I said victory could not be achieved by arms. I still hope for victory, but not by arms. For into the midst of all these policies comes the Ring of Power, the foundation of Barad-dûr and the hope of Sauron." And then he relates to all the assembled generals the plan for destroying the ring, and he concludes like this: "Therein lies all our hope. This then is my counsel. We have not the ring. In wisdom or great folly it has been sent away to be destroyed, lest it destroy us. Without it we cannot by force defeat his force. But we must at all costs keep his eye from his true peril. We cannot achieve victory by arms, but by arms we can give the ring-bearer his only chance, frail though it may be." And so the forces of good, they march against Sauron, knowing that they're outnumbered, knowing they cannot win, in the hopes that they might buy Frodo another day, another hour, another minute in their plan to reject and destroy the superior weaponry of the world. Now, there's a lot more I could say. Tolkien wrote a bunch in his letters about, atomic weaponry and the growing military-industrial complex post-World War II. But I think I'm going to end with something he wrote in 1945 as the war in Europe was ending. Something that he would have learned from his experiences fighting in World War I and then watching another, more devastating war arise a mere 20 years later. "Wars are always lost, and the war always goes on." So there you go, Julia. I hope that answered your questions as to why the good guys didn't have better weapons than the forces of evil. Though I would still say that in many ways I think they did. This episode was a much bleaker one than I anticipated it being, but the reality of war is much bleaker than Hollywood or the modern media and propagandists would have us believe. Sometimes you need the cold, hard reality of Tolkien to bring things back into focus. War must be, while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all. But I do not love the sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. Now, this is a big topic, and I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of opinions on it. So if you have any more thoughts on this topic, email me in. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. You can email me at lotramapod@gmail.com. And that's also where you can submit any questions you have. Now, be sure to tell your friends about the show, leave a 5-star rating and review, subscribe to the show so you don't miss any episodes. If you want to follow me on social media, I am always on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube. Links for all of that are below. Thank you as always to Michael for our music and Lauren for our artwork. And that's all for this week. Iluvatar willing, I'll be back next week. See you then.